Good evening, everybody. My name is Eric Schwartz. I'm the Dean of the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Didn't realize it was that funny. But I sometimes reflect on it myself and think, geez. What a pleasure, what an honor it is for me to introduce our keynote speaker tonight. Before I do, I would just want to take the liberty, perhaps the license, to offer a couple of comments. This really is a day of reflection, and I think for many of us who worked in public life, in international affairs, in foreign policy during the decade of the 90s, Rwanda was really a formative experience. For me personally, I wasn't centrally involved when I was at the National Security Council in policies surrounding Rwanda, but was close enough, especially in the years after. And for those of you who were here this morning, you heard David Whitman, who worked with me at the NSC, talk about a study that we did there, looking at how the crisis unfolded and some of the reasons behind the inaction by U.S. and other officials. But it really was a formative experience, because I think after that period, for many of us, whenever one was confronted with a crisis that looked like a crisis, but not all the dimensions of it were so clear and apparent, I think many of us felt, and whether it was in Sierra Leone in 1999 or East Timor in about the same time, or the situation in the Balkans, in Kosovo, I think many public servants looked at every subsequent crisis in a way in which you would be kind of scanning the horizon and asking the question, what might I be missing here? Because in fact, while so many of these events seem so dramatic, when you're a bureaucrat, you wake up in the morning, you go to work, you've got a bunch of emails to look at, and you go through the day. And I think the experience in Rwanda was very instructive, because I think it reinforced the notion that you've got to be scanning the horizon continually for that crisis, for that grave human rights situation, which for whatever reason you miss. I just, as I've reflected on this, I just hope and pray that it doesn't require a Rwanda every generation for us to learn that lesson, of those of us who are involved in policy, to be scanning the horizon constantly and asking yourself those questions. And this day has, I think, caused me to reflect on that as I have many times in my own career. So tonight I'm deeply honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Adama Dieng. Mr. Dieng has been serving as the United Nations Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide since 2012. Perhaps the person in the international community with the greatest responsibility to be scanning the horizon and letting the world know about grave violations of human rights. In this capacity, he collects and analyzes information on situations around the world where there may be risk of genocide, of war crimes, and other atrocities. Before his appointment to the position, Mr. Dieng served as the envoy to the United Nations Secretary General to Malawi, the United Nations independent expert on the situation in human rights in Haiti, and the Secretary General of the International Commission of Jurists. More recently, he served as the Registrar of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in Arusha, Tanzania, from 2001 to 2012. As a legal and human rights expert, his work is world-renowned. He was instrumental in the establishment of the African Court on Human and People's Rights and the creation of the African Union, Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption. He has authored many articles on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, and has lectured on numerous topics related to human rights law, humanitarian law, international justice, and genocide. Mr. Dieng provides an essential perspective in relation to many of the themes we have discussed throughout the day today, particularly justice and the prevention of genocide. He brings with him years of experience related to Rwanda, as well as expertise on violence currently unfolding around the world. I also want to acknowledge that Mr. Dieng has donated his honorarium for this speaking engagement to IACT, an organization seeking to empower individuals within communities, institutions, and governments to take personal responsibility to act on behalf of those affected by genocide, by mass atrocities, and by crimes against humanity. We are deeply honored. We are deeply honored to have you here tonight. What a pleasure and what a joy to welcome you to the University of Minnesota, and we look forward to your remarks. Adama Dieng.
Thank you very much, Eric. I would like to start by expressing my gratitude to my friends of the Human Rights Program, Barbara Frey, and the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies for inviting me to speak at this conference. This conference, which marked the 20th anniversary of the genocide perpetrated against the Tutsis in Rwanda. 20 years ago, this genocide, which targeted the Tutsi group, as well also which led to the killings of Hutus and others who stood against the genocide. This Rwandan genocide, as you know, took the lives of more than 1 million people in 100 days. This was one of the fastest, I would say, genocide ever occurred. And I would say that, to me, it was really a couple of days ago an honor to take part in the commemoration ceremony hosted by Rwanda in Kigali. That was on the 7th of April. I was very moved by the experience. Rwanda has come a long way since those dark days of 1994. But the scars of those days are still evident when we listen to the testimony of the survivors, and also when we look at the continuing impact of the genocide and its aftermath on peace and security in the region. While we remember and pay tribute to the victims of the Rwanda genocide, we must continue to strive to improve our capacity to prevent genocide and other atrocity crimes from happening anywhere else in the world. The Rwandan genocide was witnessed by the international community that made the unspeakable choice of not intervening to prevent or stop it. Whatever the motives, who is to blame for the inaction will certainly be debated for a long time. I choose to focus here on one positive aspect, which is the lessons learned from the failure, our failure of the past. Over the last 2 decades, we have witnessed unprecedented efforts to prevent mass atrocities and to effectively prosecute them when they occur. These efforts have culminated in the effective coming into force of a permanent criminal court, the ICC, as well as many institutional frameworks for the prevention of mass atrocities, including my current portfolio as UN Special Advisor on Genocide Prevention. NGOs and the civil society have joined the chorus and proved very often to be invaluable watchdogs, detecting warning signals and documenting systematically human rights violations, despite the risk associated with such an endeavor. International networks like Interpol, Eurojust, and the like serve as very useful platforms of cooperation to make the world a small place to hide for those who have indulged in violation of international humanitarian law. This international mobilization is to be praised, for we cannot afford to have a repeat of April 1994. But we have not vanquished our demons. Liberia, Sierra Leone, the DRC, Côte d'Ivoire, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, and more recently Syria, Mali, South Sudan, and Central African Republic, and I have not named them all. All these countries have attracted attention after Rwanda. We have dealt with some of these conflicts with some level of success to avoid the worst. In some cases, we have not been as efficient, as effective, as swift as we ought to have been to save human life and bring about peace. This endeavor will certainly require constant adjustment because every single life lost to this conflict is one loss too many. My office was established on the premise that genocide must be prevented and can be prevented by learning from the past and preparing for the future. From the extensive research that has been done in the last decades, we know that genocide is not a single event. We know that it is a process that takes time, planning, preparation, and resources. We know that there are many signposts along the road to genocide, and thus there are many entry points and opportunities to stop the process and save lives. The first element of the mandate that I was given by the Secretary General requires me to alert him to situations where there is a risk of genocide or other atrocity crimes. To support this risk assessment, my office has developed a framework of analysis to guide our collection and assessment of information on development worldwide that could lead eventually to genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The framework was developed based on academic research into past cases of atrocity crimes, as well as jurisprudence from the international criminal courts. I'm referring here to the ICTR, ICTY, the Sierra Leone Special Court. We encourage its use by our colleagues, member states, and civil society as a tool to assess risk and mobilize for preventive action. I'm pleased to say that the framework is currently being used to develop criteria for the assessment of situation by the United Nations under the Secretary General Rights Up Front initiatives. These are situations where there is a risk that populations could be subject to serious violations of human rights or international humanitarian law that could eventually lead to atrocity crimes. We often hear it said that what we need is not just early warning, but early action. If we are to succeed in preventing atrocity crimes, we have to invest more in early preventive action. As we have witnessed in the responses to the crisis in Central African Republic and in South Sudan, the international community is still leaving it too late. We could all see that these crises were developing, but for various reasons, not enough was done to address reports of increasing human rights violations and political tension in these countries. And now we have huge crises in which thousands of civilians have died and hundreds of thousands of others have been displaced. The cost is huge for the individuals concerned, for the state, and for the international community. Preventive action can be so much more effective and less costly. In addition to early preventive action by the international community, we must advocate for strengthening of national, regional, and international preventive efforts if we are to prevent atrocity crimes. I often say no part of the world can consider itself immune to atrocity crimes. These crimes have occurred in all regions, and all states should conduct an objective self-assessment of their vulnerability and build resilience to these crimes. We cannot afford to be blasé. No state is without tensions between communities, whether based on religion, ethnicity, and competition over resources or power, or for a combination of reasons. This means not only assessing foreign policy through lens of atrocity prevention, but also domestic policy. We welcome the appointment by a growing number of states of national focal points or mechanisms for the prevention of atrocity crimes or the implementation of the responsibility to protect, known as the R2P. The principle of R2P was adopted in 2005 by the United Nations member states, who made a commitment through their leaders to protect their populations from atrocity crimes. In this declaration, states acknowledged and reaffirmed responsibility to protect their populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, as well as from their incitement. This was the first such international commitment to protect the populations from atrocity crimes. A responsibility to protect does not, nor does it purport to shift the primary role of states to protect their own people onto the international community. Rather, it reinforces the claim that states should undertake to fulfill this role as part of their legal and political duty towards their people. In the event that the state lacks that capability, it should strive to seek support to acquire necessary means to effectively discharge this obligation. It is only when the state fails to respond to the protection needs of its people that the international community can undertake appropriate measures consistent with the United Nations Charter to protect affected populations. Ladies and gentlemen, while it is obvious that international community at the United Nations level has played a key role for an effective genocide prevention framework especially in the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide, it is equally true that at the regional level, for instance, the role of the African Union member states has tremendously evolved to respond to this reality. It has evolved from being a spectator to massive violations of human rights on the continent to an active partner in prevention of atrocities. As most would agree with me, there have been laudable efforts on genocide and other atrocity crime prevention in Africa since the establishment of the African Union. Perhaps these efforts can and indeed should be understood within the historical context on the African continent, and especially what happened in Rwanda. As most of you, academics and researchers, know, Africa has had its fair share of gross violations of human rights and atrocities which have inflicted enormous suffering on its own people. While in the aftermath of independence and successive years later on, the then Organization of the African Unity adopted various instruments of protection of human rights. These instruments achieved little in protecting civilians against mass atrocities. And of course, the main reason was that sovereignty and the principles of non-interference into the affairs of other countries were sacrosanct, and indeed the raison d'etre of the OAU itself. With the dawn of the century, when the OAU transitioned to AU, we witnessed a renewed commitment from the continental body to prevention of atrocity crimes and protection of civilians. As I said earlier, this renewed sense of commitment should be seen in light of the Rwandan genocide, which had taken place while the continental body stood aside. This new commitment was fully enshrined and reflected in the Constitutive Act, a founding instrument of the African Union. Essentially, the Constitutive Act reiterates its commitment against impunity, peaceful coexistence of and among states, respect for the rule of law and human rights, and collective intervention in internal affairs of state members to protect civilians against atrocity crimes, including war crime, genocide, and crimes against humanity. These efforts were further concretized by the establishment of the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. Increasingly, the African Union and regional bodies within the continent are taking proactive steps to enhance the continental capability to prevent atrocity crimes. The UN and AU hybrid intervention in Darfur, AMISOM role in Somalia, SADC intervention in Burundi and DRC, ECOWAS role in Liberia and Sierra Leone, collectively demonstrate the renewed commitment of the AU and regional bodies to prevent atrocities. Certainly, it is true that these bodies have fallen short in their preventive role as we continue to witness human suffering, whether in CAR or elsewhere. However, what I want to emphasize here is that AU and its regional commission have moved a long way to where we are today. I believe that increasingly the AU is gaining a required political will and capability to realize its objectives of preventing atrocity crimes. In fact, even in the current anarchy in CAR, the AU, working closely with the international community, has deployed a peacekeeping mission which is playing a key role to lessen human suffering. In South Sudan, the AU also established a commission of inquiry to investigate the atrocity crimes which have been committed since the eruption of the crisis in South Sudan last December. Building regional prevention and response capacity is also critical, and not only in Africa, but it is also valid for the other regions of the world. Regional organizations are well placed to monitor, understand, and respond quickly to worrying developments within their member states. It is in their interest to do so, and as I mentioned earlier, the Rwanda genocide had a devastating impact on the Great Lake region. The region is still, 20 years later, dealing with the consequences. The war in the eastern DRC that started after the genocide drew in 11 states, and the violence continued even after the end of that war. Until now, some 5.4 million people have died as a result of that war. It is perhaps not surprising that the 11 states involved in the war in the eastern DRC, who formed the International Conference on the Great Lake Region, the ICJLR, established a specific protocol on the prevention and punishment of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and all forms of discrimination. My office has supported the work of the regional committee set up by the ICJLR to implement the protocol. We have also supported the establishment, training, and activities of national committees. The 11 states pledged to establish national committee under the same protocol, and 6 have so far done so. These committees face challenges, but we have seen that where there is personal motivation and political support, the committees have done important work. We should support and encourage them. Other regional intergovernmental bodies have taken important initiatives to prevent atrocity crimes. 18 states from the Latin American and Caribbean region established a network in 2012 that is promoting national and regional preventive measures with a particular focus on education and training. The network was established with the support of my office and our partner, the Outreach Institute for Peace and Reconciliation. The Latin American network is notable for another reason. Several of the members of the Latin American network have themselves lived through periods in which atrocity crimes were committed. They not only recognize the importance of preventive action, but have stressed also the important role that transitional justice processes have played in the recovery and reconciliation of their people. We know that failure to address past atrocity crimes, to seek the truth about what happened, and ensure accountability for those most responsible, and to do so in a transparent, fair way, leads to a high risk of future crimes. There can be no real peace if the past is not dealt with. Justice must be done and must be seen to be done if states are to move forward. I do not believe that there should be any tension between the equally important objectives of seeking justice and accountability on the one hand, and peace and stability on the other. They are mutually reinforcing. Another relevance of the Rwandan genocide in the current conflicts may be seen in the justice and accountability context. And here I have some concern. Indeed, what appears to me as more worrisome, and which I would like to take a moment and reflect on with you, is the emerging wave in Africa that disparages international criminal justice, that presents it more as a problem than an adequate response to massive violations of human rights. The charges started with complaints against the selectivity of an international justice that goes only after soft targets, mostly Africans, while turning a blind eye on others outside the continent. More recently, the dismissal seems to be gaining steam in some quarters. Arrest warrants issued by the ICC are ignored. The jurisdiction of the court against heads of state is being called into question, if not rejected altogether, with a call to create an African criminal court or to enlarge the jurisdiction of the current African Court of Justice. To these many expressions of dissatisfaction or distrust towards the current international criminal justice, powerful voices are now giving the ideological blessing, the theoretical weapon to question its legitimacy. What the proponents of this line are saying basically is that justice should not be the priority in torn and divided societies emerging from civil wars. Because justice is inherently a blaming exercise, pointing fingers to people supposedly guilty versus those labeled as victims. It is ill-suited to bring together a divided society. It offers no incentive for people to lay down arms, make peace, and reunite. My take on this debate is that justice, particularly in the context of transition of civil war, is difficult to operate and is usually not perfect in many respects. But to wipe it away on account of its imperfection does not seem to me fair or even realistic. Those who perpetrate crimes like genocide are very often unapologetic. The ideology underlying those crimes make their perpetrators believe that they are doing good, they are removing evil through their acts. The judicial forum is one of those rare places where reconsideration, re-evaluation of their acts can be undertaken. A mere political settlement can give rise to tactical concessions, but does not necessarily result in stopping demonizing the enemy. The judicial forum imposes predetermined values to all actors. The sanctity of human life cannot be dismissed. The origin, ethnicity, gender, or spiritual creed is equal. The straitjacket is, of course, very uncomfortable to those who believe in some form of superiority of one group towards others, which is the fuel for genocide. This explains why, in the beginning of the judicial process, many accused persons would defy the court, refuse to lend its legitimacy to acknowledge its existence. But as the process is relentlessly set on motion, attitude change. Accused may deny what they are alleged to have done, but at least they no longer claim it as righteous. This is already the beginning of an interesting process of acknowledgement of the other as worthy of respect, as an equal human being. I have served the international justice for over a decade. I have witnessed this process firsthand. During the first trials of the Rwanda genocide, most of the accused persons were quite worried about the ICTR, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. While they believe that our judges took their orders from the new regime in Kigali, we are also confronted with the opposite view. The government and victims were impassioned to see conviction handed down. They were frustrated that death penalty would not be part of the sanction meted out, that detainees were being treated too well in prison. Acquittal was out of the question because they believed that the involvement of many figures was beyond dispute. As the tribunal proceeded in its business, fair trial rights were affirmed. Harsh sentences were pronounced, but acquittals too. Over time, a real shift in attitude has emerged, with both sides acknowledging that they must live with those rulings, even if they would have preferred a different outcome. This process may feel unsatisfactorily, particularly when people hold a legitimate view that they have not been fully vindicated. But we have nothing better than this imperfect tool we call justice. In the absence of justice, what we have would be the dictate of those who can tip the beam of the balance to their side. In saying this, I do not mean to downplay the role of the political process in the aftermath of civil wars. I accept that the political process may even require that justice be deferred to give more chance to peace. The ICC statute makes room for this scenario under the responsibility of the Security Council. But it would be a mistake to make use of this mechanism just to give respite or getaway to powerful political actors. Justice requires strength to prevail, but its momentary weakness should be no reason to jettison it altogether. There are now different ways of getting around the seemingly unassailable position of alleged mass atrocity perpetrators to bring them to book. The European Union, subjecting the membership of Serbia and other countries of the Balkan to their cooperation with the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, was one powerful example of shifting the balance from weakness to strength to serve the cause of justice. All nations have a duty, but powerful nations even more, to put their might at the service of justice. When they do so, justice prevails, irrespective of who is to be put on the dock. It is fortunate that most of the powerful nations are also democratic nations. This means that their parliament their press, their civil society have voices that will be audible when they cry out for justice. Today, more than ever, we need to strengthen national and regional capacity to try cases of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. But until we do, we should not oppose the prosecution of these cases by the International Criminal Court. At the United Nations, we are constantly reviewing our own processes and mechanisms for early warning and response. And as I mentioned earlier, the Secretary General recently launched the Rights Up Front initiatives to implement the recommendations of his internal review of United Nations action in Sri Lanka, which found the United Nations responsible for systemic failure in the last years of the civil war in Sri Lanka. The Rights Up Front initiative aims to improve the United Nations system ability to respond in a timely, coordinated, and effective way to situations where there is a risk of massive and widespread human rights violations and complex crises, using the breadth of its mandate. The mechanisms set up have already been used in the case of Central African Republic and South Sudan, and my office has been central to efforts to improve internal coordination and analysis of information relevant to situations at risk of atrocity crimes. To the survivors of the genocide, we owe a commitment to take all possible measures within our power to protect populations from another Rwanda. The ongoing crises in many places around the world are a clear reminder to all of us in this room that we still have a lot to do to make prevention of atrocity crimes a reality. Prevention of genocide is a shared responsibility, and it is the role of each and every of us. Civilians around the world, men, women, children, and the elderly, continue to be killed, displaced, and discriminated against on the basis of their identity. We should double our efforts to protect them from atrocity crimes and ensure that all are treated with the dignity and respect that is due on the basis of our common humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, during my recent mission to Central African Republic, I witnessed at first hand how human rights violations can easily spill into atrocities against innocent civilians if they are not addressed. With the weakest and corrupt, or in some cases unavailable state institutions, it remains the primary role of the United Nations and other regional institutions that may be available on the ground to raise alarm against impending atrocities. This is the reason why my office continues to explore ways to enhance coordination of our efforts with other partners within and outside the UN system to ensure that information on early warning on potential atrocities are shared with relevant stakeholders for timely action. And I believe that working closely with other stakeholders, both in the field and at the policy level, can significantly enhance our ability to timely recognize and respond to these violations as potential precursor of genocide and other atrocity crimes. Today, civilians are increasingly becoming the key target in armed conflict, as evidenced through the various instances of mass atrocities in recent years. It is this unfortunate development that compels us to enhance both international and regional efforts to protect civilians. Both states and non-state actors have a primary duty to ensure that legal and physical protection of civilians is guaranteed in the context of armed and non-armed conflict. These actors must be constantly reminded of their obligations under international humanitarian law to protect civilians. These efforts highlight the need for an increased focus on the protection of civilians who are generally the targeted population in instances of mass atrocity crimes. To show the new way the UN is operating, last December, when the crisis started in South Sudan, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon instructed immediately his special representative for South Sudan, Hilda Johnson, to open the gates of UN compound. Hadn't those gates been open, certainly we would have seen thousands and thousands of people being killed. Hopefully, the gates were open throughout the country of UN compounds, and only in Juba, 70,000 people were protected thanks to those gates which were open. And if you compare it with what happened in 1994 in Rwanda, where people did not have that possibility to be protected within the UN compound, where when General Dallaire requested more troops, this was not responded positively. When those troops came, it was simply to save their fellow countrymen, and I'm referring here particularly to the people from the Western world, which led General Dallaire to say the world is racist. And if I say the world, I'm saying the Western world. That was his code. Simply, it would have sufficed to have few soldiers in the very stadiums in Kigali or in the UN compound, and one would have saved so many lives. But today, civilians, including women and children, are no longer just caught in crossfire. They have become a direct target of violence and during worse crimes, including rape and forcible recruitment in warring rebel faction. And whenever civilians are deliberately targeted because they belong to a particular community or ethnic group, it is evident that we are confronting potential or indeed actual genocide. We can no longer afford to be blind to this grim dynamic, nor should we imagine that appeals to morality without credible threat of action will have much effect on people who have adopted a deliberate strategy of killing and forcible expulsion. Anyone who embarks on genocide commits crimes against humanity. It is therefore important that humanity must respond by taking action in its own defense. It is our collective obligation to stand firm and provide a shield to the defenseless. Genocide almost always occurs during war. So one of the best ways to reduce the chances of genocide is to address the causes of conflict. I must, however, say that while these efforts are critical to prevention and resolution of conflict, and indeed have made significant contribution to this effect, we have to move beyond early warning to early action. We have to strengthen our institutions to timely and effectively respond to potential conflicts and general threat to peace and security of our people. Even the best system of early warning will be less helpful unless states are able and willing to take action when the warning is received. Despite the continued support of the member states, we are still short of the prevention threshold enshrined in the Genocide Convention. We are still confronted with realities of our limitation and political will to act. The ongoing carnage in Syria is a stark reminder of our limitation and ability to undertake robust action to protect population from atrocity crimes. We have entered the 4th year of the crisis in Syria. We have lost more than 150,000 people, and yet we are not able to ensure protection to the people of Syria. And knowing the context of that place, only the risk, I can say, will be higher and higher, and even a risk of a genocide could not be excluded. People being killed simply because of who they are. They can be Alawite, they can be Sunni, they can be Druze, because we have such hatred in that country today that we have to really do something. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I can state that I don't believe that genocide need to occur for us to learn better ways of preventing genocide. The best lesson we can draw from the Rwandan tragedy is our commitment to build and strengthen existing institutions to better respond to potential acts that may serve as a precursor to genocide. We can demonstrate our commitment to prevention of genocide if our vision for the future is informed by an enduring commitment to the rule of law, protection of fundamental rights and freedoms of our people, equitable development premised on social and economic justice, and strong institutions to guarantee peaceful resolution of our differences. I strongly believe that prevention is a better strategy than intervention after the fact. As a former registrar of the ICTR, an institution that was established by the Security Council in the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide to try those who bear greatest responsibility for this crime, I too well understand the price of inaction to prevent atrocities. I speak from painful experience when I say that serious human rights violations are the best early warning of likely atrocities. Prevention of genocide and other atrocity crimes must start, therefore, with addressing day-to-day human rights violations. We can pay tribute to the victims of the Rwandan genocide if we commit ourselves to prevent occurrence of conflicts and protection of the vulnerable populations in the event such conflict occur, and holding to account those who instigate and support such violence. To enable us to have some interaction, I will simply say a quote of Martin Luther King. Luther King said, "The end we must seek is a society at peace with itself, a society that can live with with its conscience. End of quote. This is a thought we must put to ourselves periodically. What is the society we live in? What are the values we promote? How will future generations judge us? What are we, as individuals, doing to guide the course of our civilization? And can we live with all of this on our conscience? I have spoken at length today about the lessons from Rwanda and the contribution we have already made in the name of prevention of genocide. Commitment to genocide prevention is our attempt in ensuring that we, as international community and as a global society, we can create a society that will resonate with the vision of Martin Luther King, a society that is at peace and a society that can live with its conscience. I would like simply to say to all of you, thank you for listening, and may the Almighty God bless all of you abundantly. Thank you.
So we thank you for being here with us, but we also thank you for your commitment, your personal commitment to justice and to the prevention of genocide. And I think that we are all want to support you in that work. I'm going to start with a few questions before we open the conversation up to the audience. And what I thought we could do would be to start closest to Rwanda and then work our way out a little bit. And it's interesting for us to have this commemoration of Rwanda here, and we have a very North American perspective on the events there, and a lot of guilt about what should have been done, and a lot of criticism about what has been done or hasn't been done. But you were just in Rwanda, and you've had so much of your professional experience related to that country's experience. Now, it made me think about how the Rwanda genocide and its aftermaths are perceived around the world. I think we understand a little bit more about how they're perceived in Rwanda. But are those lessons that we're trying to learn, are they lessons that are discussed in other parts of Africa, outside of the region, in the international community, or do we get very myopic about particular situations and assume that everybody is learning lessons from Rwanda? Is the world learning lessons in these 20 years since Rwanda?
I would say that, unfortunately, still today, there are a lot of society which remain blind. And if you look what happened in Kenya in 2007, the electoral violence, when you see people killing each other simply because of they belong to another ethnic group. You see what is happening today in Central African Republic, where people are being killed because they are Muslim. When you see what happened also in Côte d'Ivoire at a time, simply because of issue regarding nationalities. And of course, all these situations were wrapped into political issue, political competition. But at the end of the day, we realize that there is a need to invest more on education if we want really people to be able to learn from the Rwandan tragedy. And that is one of the reasons my office recently concluded an agreement with UNESCO to launch a program of education to Holocaust and the prevention of genocide. And this will start with a series of 5 workshop meetings throughout the world, all the regions. But we are planning to do even more. My office recently decided to sponsor a project called Genocide. Xeno, like xenophobia. It was a kind of words being played around. And inviting young people to produce a video and to express their own vision, how they see it. And it's amazing. For instance, there is one of those videos where a young girl of 13 years old was interviewing her grandma. The grandma was telling the story of what she felt when she saw her neighbor, who was a Jew, being transported. That was from Paris. And she interacted with the grandma. And I think that is something extremely important, to let the young people to also get involved in this project. And what we are doing also is with the Auschwitz, which is our partner, doing training for diplomats, for civil societies. We take them to to Auschwitz, Birkenau. We spend a week there. And my intent is also to launch the same program also in Rwanda. And I want to have, before end of this year, a regional conference in Africa around the theme Prevention of Genocide and the Responsibility to Protect. And I want that meeting to take place in Addis Ababa, the headquarters of the African Union, so that the diplomats there be also educated on this issue. But ultimately, what I want is that from 2015, have diplomats, civil societies, to travel once a year to Kigali, to go on the very site, because I think that's important. I mean, it might be cheaper than sending them to Auschwitz. Some, if we have the means, we'll continue having people going to Auschwitz, because we have to keep this project, education to Holocaust, and the prevention of genocide.
Mm-hmm. Great. So let's move the discussion then a little bit away from the events and the commemoration to talk about the issue of justice. You spoke quite eloquently of justice, and you're a lawyer and a former judge.
That's my life, former registrar.
That's right. So, and then registrar at the International Criminal Tribunal on Rwanda for more than a decade. So you really saw firsthand the kind of tensions, the critiques, the problems, the accomplishments of that particular tribunal. And so we had an interesting discussion today on some of our panel earlier this afternoon when we were talking about the Gacaca court experiences, which had processed this phenomenal number of cases, almost 2 million cases, compared to the 50 that were tried in the tribunal. It's not a fair comparison, I understand. We kept coming back to enough justice. What's enough justice? That the Gacaca process served as a way to move people from out of prisons back into their communities in a way that would not have met our sense of legal due process, and yet somehow it was enough justice. So I just wondered if you'd reflect a little bit on whether our sense as lawyers of justice and due process ideas are too, in some situations, are they too strict? Should we be thinking of more flexible ways to allow people to come to account for the past without having such costly, slow processes?
Well, I would say, first of all, that the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda was established not to try all suspects of genocide, but only those who are the ringleaders. And thanks to the international community establishing this tribunal, it was possible to bring to account the entire government of the genocide regime which was in place. And that was the first time, in fact, that head of government, Kambanda, was tried before this, Arusha and sentenced for the remainder of his life to remain, to be in prison. So, and not 50, but 76 people have been tried, and there are, of course, and convicted, some were acquitted, and now we are in the final completion of those cases remaining in appeal. Of course, there has been criticism level against the tribunal, saying it was too costly. And here I should simply say that this was the first time you had a tribunal which doesn't have its own policy, doesn't have its own witness protection, nothing. Everything had to start from scratch. And even unlike the sister court, the ICTY, we had to build a prison, a detention center. So, and you have also to make sure that you bring witnesses from all parts of the world. We have brought no less than 2,800 witnesses from 33 countries. And for the defense, most of these witnesses were either illegal residents or refugees. So you needed to have them, provide them with travel documents so that they can come down. To say simply that it was costly, not to say about also the cost for interpretation, translation. So, and that's why I said, and I'm glad that you said, we cannot compare those two. We cannot compare the achievements of the Gacaca courts and the achievement of the Arusha Tribunal. The Gacaca court played an important role, there is no doubt. But at the same time, you would have noticed that there was not even, despite the fact that they elected about 200, I think 50,000 judges for the Gacaca. Some of those judges themselves were identified during the process as being genocidaires. So, and some judges were corrupt. But this did not, I would say, detract the importance of the Gacaca. I was at the closing of the Gacaca when the documents were being deposited and bringing an end. Because there was a first attempt, but they did not complete the work. So, and that day I was very moved, because here was one genocidaire who was convicted through the Gacaca, and standing close to him was a survivor whose entire family was killed. There were about, I think, 11 or 14 her family members. And when this convict was telling the story, how he killed the members of the family of that survivor, where he, I would not even use the word bury, but where he buried them. But still, this survivor had forgiven to this criminal. Where I was sitting, I was so shocked. I could not believe that. But that is to say that this Gacaca system, which is a traditional way, did help a lot as a healing process. It helped a lot to promote reconciliation. I cannot say that the Gacaca applies the criteria which are in Article 14 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I mean, one may criticize. I remember Human Rights Watch criticizing the Gacaca, saying that they do not meet those criteria. But I say we don't need. What is important is that those who have committed this horrendous crime recognize that they have done so and express remorse, So I think that is what is important, and that's why I did support it. And I remember at a time I met with President Kagame, who took a decision to set free about 25,000 detainees, mainly the elderly and the young people and those who were sick. That decision was not welcomed by many survivors groups, but I think it was important because you had not enough space in the detention facilities in Rwanda to have all these people. So there was a need to really find a way to re-educate those people who confess the crimes they have committed. They went in the re-education camp, and I think that was also another way of addressing justice and promoting reconciliation. And finally, I would say also extremely important was the courageous decision President Kagame did take to propose the abolition of death penalty. Because at the time there was so much emotion, and he managed to succeed on that process as well. So to say that we have to accept that what is critical is to ensure that fair trial is guaranteed. And when I say fair trial is, you should, even in those traditional systems, make sure that the accused has the right to defend himself or herself. I think that is extremely important. And within the Gacaca system, people had the possibility to defend themselves. They have the possibility to call their witnesses to come and testify for them. Maybe it's not the Western system we know, but that doesn't mean that the Western system is a perfect system. We do see in Western countries wrong decision being made, and when we discussed sometime, I was saying that one day when I retire, I would like maybe to see how we can find a new system. We have today the common law system, we have the civil law system, but none of those systems is perfect. And I was saying, how can we reconcile those two systems? How can we bring the African traditional justice system together and in view to create a new system where whoever is brought to count, whoever is tried, will finally accept the decision which has been rendered, which is extremely difficult because most of the time when you go to justice in Africa, going to the court is seen as a dispute, not it's while, and that's one of the reasons it took time, for instance, to establish the African Court, because the idea originated in 1961 during the first Congress of the African Jurists, which was convened by the International Commission of Jurists. But people said, no. In Africa, we solve problems through conciliation, through the palaver tree. That's where we sit and discuss. In Africa, if you don't express your view, that means you are not in agreement. In the Western tradition, we have this say in French, qui ne dit rien consent. If you don't say anything, that means you consent, you are in agreement. But in the African tradition, if you don't say anything, that means you are not in agreement. And what was done in those traditions, in those days, we said, okay, let's suspend the discussion now. And then in the evening, we said, okay, Adama, you go and meet with Robert, etc., and ask him why he did not express his view. Robert will then say, well, you know, this and that. And at the end of the day, he said, come on, you're right, Robert. Although he was the minority, and the following day, around the palaver tree, he will express his view. So which means that freedom of expression was there during those days. But unfortunately, we noticed after, when the colonial rulers came, colonized, all those systems were destroyed. So we copied, unfortunately, all the wrong things from the colonial rulers. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to sneak in one more question, and then we're going to open it up and have microphones for people for your questions. But I can't help talking about R2P, the responsibility to protect, the new doctrine that you discussed from 2005. And I want to bring up the sticky case of Syria, which you addressed in your remarks as well. But, you know, Syria reminds us that as much as we are committed to this new doctrine of responsibility to protect, when there are two great powers disagreeing, the world is in a tough place. So I wondered if you just could reflect on that a little bit, in the sense of just in talking about sitting by and watching people die. It's a very helpless situation for the human rights community and the world at large to be watching what's going on in Syria. And it's you know, one of the questions I have, for instance, is what would have been the point of entry if there had been a point of entry? Is that point so far past that the international community has just given up on the case? And again, what can we do in this situation, which looms large right now, where two of the great powers have very different opinions about intervention?
Well, I should say that when the crisis started in Syria, it was simply a call for more freedom, more democracy, more respect of human rights, and the answer from the regime was repression. And when it started, quickly we noticed that there were even crimes against humanity being committed. My office issued a statement at the time. Nothing happened. The Security Council failed to adopt a single resolution on the Syria cases. And when we said, when the international community is going to intervene, when is Syria an R2P case? I should say that when we talk about R2P, R2P is not only military intervention. R2P start first with the first pillar is the responsibility, primary responsibility of the state. The second, the assistance the international community can provide. And the third is also where the international community can use force, but force will be used as ultimate recourse. But before using force, you have other tools. And Chapter 6 of the Untitled Chapter, I mean, you have the possibility of imposing sanctions. None of those were done. And people were making parallel. We have Kosovo. Why not? But in the case of Kosovo, the Security Council did pass a resolution before, not for the use of force, but at least there was. That's only when we had this chemical weapon issue that finally the Council came to some kind of consensus. But you have also to remember that when the world leaders met in 2005, regarding the third pillar, they made it very clear that it will be on a case by case. What does it mean? it means at the end of the day that you cannot expect the Security Council to be consistent. And I say, we, United Nations Secretariat, we have to be always consistent. But when the Security Council deal, you have national interest sometimes, you have other interests behind the decision. And that's why recently the use of the veto was being put on the public domain discussion. And I think soon there might be even a discussion on this issue of the veto. Should the veto be used when we are facing a situation like Syria, where atrocity crimes are being committed? So the idea is to develop a kind of a code of conduct within the Security Council so that those states which have the veto will refrain using their veto to block an intervention. Because, as you know, there has been a recommendation in that regard on Syria. But, of course, the veto would have been applied. As you said, you have the two powers. But one may even ask, would even United States or Russia, would they be willing to go for it? And would they be ready to say, we'll not use our veto? And the veto, also, you have to put it into a context. We remember how, following the failure of the League of Nations, when the San Francisco Charter was adopted in 1945, when they introduced it, the veto, it was for a purpose. And nowadays, are the 5 permanent members ready to say, okay, I'm not sure, but I think at least we need to have more, I would say, moral when it comes to protecting human dignity, protecting the life of innocent victims.
It's a very interesting position. Thank you. I know we're running a little bit late, but I want to make sure that the audience gets to participate. So let's make sure we fit in a few questions before we close. There are microphones coming down. Introduce yourself.
Thanks. I'm Gregory Gordon, former ICTR prosecutor and director of the Center for Human Rights and Genocide Studies at the University of North Dakota. Thank you for the wonderful address and your thoughts. And I think this last topic I found a particular interest because R2P is really, in a way, more of a hortatory doctrine. And I'm wondering if, in light of the UN Charter, Article 2.4, and which prohibits use of force, and the only exceptions being Article 51 for self-defense or collective defense, and Security Council authorization for use of force through Chapter 7, if we need to have another exception for use of force for purposes of humanitarian crises where mass atrocities are taking place, because R2P still relies on the Security Council to authorize force, and that's obviously not working. Or potentially, and maybe in addition to that, an optional protocol for the Genocide Convention, because as we heard earlier today, the way the Genocide Convention is framed now, there is no specific obligation for intervention. So those two possibilities, I'd love to hear your thoughts on.
Well, I should say that 2 years or 3 years ago, the then Prime Minister of Slovenia called on me to discuss about putting in place a mechanism for strengthening the Genocide Convention, that vacuum. My original answer was, well, I don't think the problem is a lack of a provision of a mechanism within the convention. The problem is a lack of political will. It's a lack of political will. And therefore, what we need to do is to really name and shame those who have the political power to make the difference. We are here in the United States. Efforts have been made, for instance, to establish what is called the Atrocity Prevention Board, which is already a positive step in the sense that at least it could help to identify risk factors, to really scan the situation. But then when it comes to take action, we notice at some stage when we said, okay, what is the red line? If ever we reach that red line, the United States will deploy it. And I was among those who was not very much also in favor of a military intervention. Because at that time, my analysis was, well, giving arms to the rebels, very early I made it, said, we may run the risk of having arms on the hands of Al-Qaeda militants. And later on, intelligence from many Western countries had found evidence that Al-Qaeda's group, jihadis, were involved. So there was that risk. And the second risk was also, of course, the whole situation in the Golan. So, but this is not the reason. And that is why I said the reason is the early action, as I was saying earlier. It's not the early warning, but the early action. Had at the beginning decision been taken by Security Council members, we would have not seen 150,000 people being killed in Syria, would not have seen the millions of people today living in exile in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Turkey, putting even at risk those countries. So there is not, I would say, a response one can give to this question. But it might serve a purpose, at least of having that protocol, that, as we said in French, abondance de biens ne nuit pas. Having too much goods doesn't make harm, you know. Having too bad things could be harmful, but having too much good things cannot make any harm. Mm-hmm. So if we can develop that protocol, at the end of the day, of course, those states which are committed will sign the protocol, but those who have really the leverage to make the difference may still be out of that protocol. But let's move on that direction, at least to see what we can achieve.
I think we only have time for one more question. My boss is telling me up there, so.
I was intrigued by the word genocide that you used, and I want to try to ask a question that kind of comes from that. Is there, in your office and at the UN, some discussion, conversation beginning to happen about the possibility of expanding the Genocide Charter to include categories such as gender, sexual orientation, political? And then to answer that probably is easy, but you probably know where I'm going with the question, and what you said earlier about the time to act is when a state does not take care of its citizens. And in 2 African countries, I know that there are laws that have been put into place that put some pretty high price on same-sex activity. They would argue that they're protecting their citizens through those laws. And I'm just wondering, where is the conversation about those things at this point at the UN?
But on the first point, genocide, this is a word which was hazarded by one American film producer called Michael Kirtley, and who has initiated this World Memory Film Project. And the reason was that instead of using genocide to promote prevention of genocide, he felt that by using xenocide, that will be less dramatic, much easier to accept. And I do remember when I was being interviewed for this position I'm occupying today, I was told that, but you know, there are still states which are very reluctant to welcome the special advisor on the prevention of genocide, because they will feel that if you come in their countries, that means there is a risk of a genocide. But I may say that there is a truth about that, because people tend to think definitely that there is a risk of a genocide. That's why you are coming in their country. I just returned from Burundi, and when I addressed it, my interlocutors, including the president of Burundi, I said, look, don't think that your country is at a risk of genocide. I started with really calming down. So, but the thing is that I like it, the genocide, simply because when we talk about genocide, that is the, I would say, the ultimate form of discrimination. The ultimate form of discrimination. And when you exclude people from simply because of what they are, who they are, and you end it by deciding to exterminate them partially or totally, simply because they are Muslim, they are Tutsi, they are Jews, they are, that's really when you, now, to add the second point, should one add, as you said, gender, politics, etc. I think this question is coming more and more. Should the gays, the lesbian be protected? I mean, to my view, I don't see today a risk of a particular group being targeted with the intent to exterminate that group. That is one. But then, when it comes to the gender, you may have certainly noticed in the Akayesu judgment that rape committed under certain circumstances equate to genocide. So that means the Arusha Tribunal expanded through that judgment the definition of genocide. And nothing would prevent tomorrow another tribunal, depending if that situation relating to the situation of gays and lesbian, that the discrimination affecting that group, you know, nothing would prevent that certainly in the reasoning of those judges to conclude maybe. But that is, for the time being, my office is not working on that issue, but the debate is being within certain circles. I think there is one point I missed from your question.
Well,
I covered it.
You'll have to meet him afterwards for a drink. I think that we've had a very long conference day. I thank all of you for your patience. I would like to thank all of the panelists and the organizers. A special shout out to Kayla McConnon, who we should all applaud for organizing today's event. And Mr. Dieng, it's been a real honor and a pleasure having you here, and I hope you will count on us as we're thinking creatively and strategically about how to make your office irrelevant and immaterial in international relations. Thank you for joining us.